Estimados amigos,
distinguished friends, I call to order the 12th meeting of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished observers and friends, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin our consideration of Agenda Item 5, discussion on the theme, Indigenous Peoples, Conflict, Peace and Resolution.
I now move on to our last speaker. That is Mr. Yohanes Anari. He is from the Organisasi Pribumi Papua Barat. And Mr. Anari has had his education in different parts of Indonesia, mostly in West Java and Central Java, and also in his college days, and lastly at the Indonesia Science Institute of Technology. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Anari to join the discussion, please.
Dear Excellency, Chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Yohanes Anari. I am the leader of West Papua Indigenous Organization, but we changed to West Papua Liberation Organization, or WPLO. I offer my heartfelt thanks to the Permanent Forum for giving me this opportunity to address this forum. For benefit of the people of West Papua, I and West Papua Liberation Organization am asking this forum to understand both the cause of the conflict which we are suffering and the solution which the Economic and Social Council can provide for us. Most states that come into conflict with an indigenous community do so because the community has land or resources that the state wants. Unfortunately, West Papua had the misfortune of having gold and other minerals that certain American businessmen wanted. 20 years ago, Mr. Santon introduced the concept of 8 states of genocide. 8 steps which can condition a society to commit genocide. But I submit that the 4 indigenous communities there are normally only 2 states, greed and deception. Greed is the motive, and deception includes all the lies that allege that and indigenous people are less entitled to their home and their lives. Nobody can prevent greed, but the deception can be fought with education and public awareness of the humanity of indigenous communities. If each of oppressed indigenous community had use of equipment and access to an independent media channel, the accidency of oppressive state might be peacefully reduced. Even a small deception can cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. For 54 years, West Papua have been victim of such a deception. A deception at the United Nations, alleging that reporting the progress of the colony could be exercised by the General Secretary UTAN instead of Trusteeship Council, as is required by the Charter of the United Nations. This is a deception which the Economic and Social Council can end this year by putting the issue of West Papua on the agenda of the Trusteeship Council, as should have been done in 1962. The indigenous people of West Papua are no less deserving than the other people of the protection promised by the Charter of the United Nations. So I again ask that this forum recommend to the Economic and Social Council that it put the international issue of the General Assembly Resolution 1752 on the agenda of the Trusteeship Council, as should have been done in 1962. I wish to explain briefly how West Papua became the subject of General Assembly Resolution 1752. I will continue using the name of West Papua, my homeland, although the United Nations during 1960s used title including Netherlands, New Guinea, or West New Guinea and West Irian. During the 19th and 20th century, West Papua permitted a Dutch presence, and in December 1950, the United Nations in General Assembly Resolution 448 on 5th session agreed that Netherlands owned an obligation to respect West Papua cultural, political, economic, and other rights. But in 1959, Mr. John Henderson proposed the United States could use an United Nations trusteeship to transfer the administration of West Papua to the United Nations and then to the Republic of Indonesia. And by March 1961, the United States believed that Indonesia, on condition that the trusteeship would not be called a trusteeship. We support would support the American plan for a United Nations trusteeship of West Papua. The Dutch tried to fight the American ambition in 1961 by asking the General Assembly to approve a normal United Nations trusteeship of West Papua. Unfortunately, the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was killed on 18 September 1961, 8 days before the Assembly's vote. And without the assistance of the Hammarskjöld advice, a bid for trusteeship that would have been reported to the the Trusteeship Council failed. In December 1961, the Republic of Indonesia began a small or token invasion of West Papua, after which the United States began negotiation asking the Netherlands to sign the United Nations trusteeship agreement, which the United States and Indonesia had been preparing since 1959. Indonesia released an American pilot, Mr. Allen Pope, in July 1962, an agreement asking the General Assembly to approve a United Nations occupation and administration of West Papua by signing the agreement and the Indonesian on 15 August 1962. On the next day, 16 August 1962, New York Times published a public endorsement by the new Secretary General proclaimed the benefit of agreement which had just been signed by the Netherlands and Indonesia. A month later, a draft text for the General Assembly resolution was presented to the United Nations membership on the day before they were asked without debate to vote on agreement asking the United Nations to occupy and administrate West Papua. The government of Benin, Mr. Dahomey, then expressed outrage that the people of West Papua had not been consulted and the agreement did not require that the indigenous people of West Papua permit to have a referendum. The government of Togo deplored the haste of the vote and the lack of time the UN member had read to the text of agreement. And 3 days later, the government of Senegal asked to change the record of its vote from affirmative to negative. Despite the haste of the vote, the General Assembly approved agreement, and 10 days later, on the 1st October 1962, the United Nations took over the administration of West Papua. Please understand, although U.S. record assert that Indonesia didn't want to call the trusteeship a trusteeship, that the first line of the 1962 agreement refers to the trusteeship relationship by saying that the purpose of the agreement is the interest and welfare of the people of the territory of West New Guinea or West Irian. In addition to the agreement, the physical act of occupying West Papua also placed the United Nations into the position of a trustee administration the territory for benefit of the people of West Papua. and that event should also have been reported to Trusteeship Council by means of the agenda of the Trusteeship Council in accordance with Article 85, Part 2 of the Charter of the United Nations. I also remind this forum and remind the Economic and Social Council that Article 103 of the Charter of the United Nations does not permit any obligation of charter to be mitigated or feared by any agreement. Therefore, request in the 1962 agreement asking the Secretary General receive and distribute information about West Papua does not extinguish the obligation of the United Nations described in Article 85, Part 2 of the Charter of the United Nations. It is Article 85, Part 2 of the Charter of the United Nations that entitled West Papua to make this request for this forum to recommend to the Economic and Social Council that it put the international issue of General Assembly Resolution 1752 on the agenda of the Trusteeship Council. Any debate about the Charter of the United Nations obligation is in the jurisdiction of International Court of Justice, from whom the Trusteeship Council will be asking for any advisory opinion once the issue of the General Assembly Resolution 171 and the General Resolution 1752 are put on the Council's agenda, as should have been done in September 1962. In the name of the Lord, I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anari.